Hi everybody, welcome to your next video lecture for intercultural communication. In this video we are going to answer the big question, how does the self relate to culture? We've spent some time in the previous video really dissecting the three different types of identity that we have, right? The three different levels of identity. Personal identity, which is our self-concept, who we are, who we want to be, and who we will be. Our social identity, which is based on the roles or the groups that we fall into based on society. And cultural identity, where we actually decide to be members of different groups and align with the beliefs, values, norms, and social practices that they follow. So in this lecture, we're going to dig into this question by really looking at the formation of cultural identity, and then we're going to look at a comparison of some of the characteristics of cultural identity and how inevitably this could result in some tension within one's cultural identity. So let's start by understanding the formation of cultural identity. We're answering the big question here, how does culture affect society and the self? And to start this, I want us to just kind of take a look at this. It's a word-based video, so there's no talking. But pay attention to some of the ways that this video describes the interactions between the self and culture. I think that very final line, right, that because we are a part of a society, culture will always be part of our identities, is a clear way of moving forward, understanding the interrelationship between the self and culture. That culture, the groups that we are a part of, are obviously going to influence the way we see ourselves, who we want to be, what we think of as important, etc. And so when it comes to the formation of a cultural identity, we do think about it in three different stages, or kind of three different steps. The first is the unexamined cultural identity, then we have a cultural identity search, and then finally we have this level of achievement of cultural identity. The first is going to be unexamined cultural identity, where people do not really take a look at their cultural issues, but rather take culture for advantage. So this is going to be most often associated with children who don't really understand that they're in a culture, right, at all. And this can also be adults who might be part of a culture, but they don't want anything to do with that culture, right? So people who might have been born in one country who emigrated to a different country, who don't want anything to do with that other culture. They might be in an unexamined state, right? This is especially prominent for people who just don't know it's a part of their culture. For instance, I didn't know I was Swedish until my mom finally did her lineage, her genealogy, and found out that she had some Swedish in her, which means that I have some Swedish in me, right? And that's an unexamined cultural identity right now because I just didn't know it existed. I don't know to look at the issues affecting that cultural group. The next stage is really going to be an exploration stage where people take a look at and begin to question their cultures. So this might be if I recognize that I have some Swedish in me, I might start to say, okay, what does it mean to be Swedish? What are some things that I should believe in? What are some things that I should value? What are some ways I should dress? What should I eat? What festivals or flags or faces should I be into? All of that can really be answered in this second stage where we are searching for those different ways that we can express that culture. And obviously when we start expressing our culture in that observable and tangible level, right? Where we're looking at things that we can really see and that other people can observe as well. It's when we start getting into this cultural achievement, this cultural identity achievement, where people have confidently accepted themselves and internalized their culture, that they really come to believe in or to follow the beliefs, values, and norms that have been established, right? And that's what's important here, is that as we think about this process, it's not necessarily that you do this one time and you always do it consciously, right? But it does suggest that as we come to understand that we are a part of different cultures, we are a part of different groups, we're going to engage in some of these activities. Let me give you a really, really clear example from my own kind of anecdotal experience. When I was applying for jobs at the conclusion of my doctorate program, I applied for jobs across the nation. I had job applications in Illinois, Michigan, Oklahoma, obviously, Florida, California, Arizona. The list kind of goes on. I think I had sent out 27 applications in 18 different states. And so one of the things that happened when I got the job at Northeastern State University is I had to start recognizing that I had an unexamined cultural identity, right? I was going to be joining this Oklahoman culture. I need to understand a little bit about what that means. And so I can do some search, right? I can do some exploration through that second stage and really see that my move to Oklahoma is a real part of why I am forming that cultural identity, right? And when I start believing and valuing things similarly to the people who've always been here, you can say I've finally hit that third stage, that achievement stage. So that is the formation of cultural identity. That doesn't necessarily answer all the questions we have. We also need to look at the characteristics of cultural identity because this is going to be where we really start seeing some of the impacts of the self and culture, how they kind of interrelate. So the first thing to recognize is that a person can have more than one cultural identity. Right? Because we are part of so many different social groups, it's unrealistic to assume we would only ever have one identity. This is especially so when we think about the different subcultures that it can exist within the majority culture. And so this allows us to think about cultural identity around three kind of key characteristics. The first characteristic of cultural identity is that there are different identities become centralized as different characteristics become activated. And so basically what that means is as we go about different social groups, different parts of our cultural identity will become more central to who we are and to what our culture is than others, right? And so if, for instance, I am at a national communication conference, I'm probably going to really give in to that scholar, to that academic part of my culture and part of my identity than I am to other parts of it because of the environment and because certain characteristics have become activated. I need to have different parts of my identity be more central to who I am. The second characteristic is that cultural identity is dynamic. It's essentially saying that even in the briefest of encounters with people whose backgrounds differ from our own our sense of who we are at that instant may well be altered, even if in some small way, which will then send ripples down the stream, right? That if we are altered in this moment, that is going to continue altering us throughout time. We are dynamic individuals. Humans are dynamic. We are a dynamic species. We are constantly looking for change, right? And so I think it's important to recognize that even if we have brief encounters with people from other cultures, that is going to become a part of who we are, right? Our interaction with them is going to change the way we understand the self. And that's what's really important. And third, cultural identity is multifaceted, which is essentially saying that many people's identities are not locked in, but they incorporate multiple different identities as well. So because we are multifaceted, right, we have different identities that become central to who we are, which keep changing as we are more and more or more and less dynamic, which is really important to understand. All of this is to say that we are not just one thing. Our identities are made up of multiple cultures. So there are a lot of different factors and a lot of different people who are going to have influence on who we are as individuals, right? Who we are as the self. So these characteristics of cultural identity, that different elements of it become central at different times, that it is dynamic and always changing, and that it is multifaceted, essentially tells us that our identities are not set in stone. Okay? Things can change. We are able to go through transformations. We are able to understand new experiences. We are able to take in new information. And all of that allows us to grow, to become better, more self-aware individuals, right? So really what we're doing here is we're understanding that the self is constantly going to be influenced by what's going on and who is around us. Now, this is what's going to be very important to realize, though, is that when we look in the mirror, remember, we're seeing a self-image. We're seeing something that relates to our self-concept, to our personal identity. And where this starts becoming a challenge, especially across cultures, is when our self-concept, when our self-image differs from what other people tell us we are, right? Remember, social identity exists. It tells us that we are who we are based on these different social roles, these different social factors. And when that conflicts with who we think we are, right, when those various elements are in conflict with each other, or when the elements of our culture tells us we do not belong, it is hard for our self-concept to continue to be seen or feel in a positive way, right? Our self-esteem takes a crack, our self-image starts to shatter a little bit, and then who we are when we look in the mirror starts to differ from who other people tell us we are. And that is why it's so important to understand that culture and who we are going to be so intermingled, right? The self is not something that is understood as a microcosm, right? It is not something that exists in isolation to the social group. All of us as individuals have some connection to the larger cultural understanding, to the larger society, and that's important, right? And one of the things that we really look to in this class is to understand that people are constantly going to be throwing out understandings of who they think we are, but that doesn't necessarily get to who we actually are. Right? And that is why it is so important to start our understanding of culture with an understanding of identity. Again, as I've stated, self-awareness is one of our imperatives for studying culture. Identity is understanding who we are and understanding our self-concept, which is influenced by the different things that people tell us, the different groups that people assume we are a part of, right? And a lot of this is going to be explained further when we start getting into bias and why humans have different bias against or for different people. But that is everything for this lecture. We described the formation of cultural identity, so how it is something that happens from an unexamined state to an exploration state to an achievement state. And then we compared the characteristics of cultural identity, that it is different elements of our cultural identity become centralized at different moments, that it is dynamic, so always changing, and that it is multifaceted, so we are not just one thing. And that is why it is so important to understand how the self relates to culture, because the information we take in from our culture is inevitably going to influence the self, right? This is in a push and pull relationship. We do not control 100% of who we are, right? We are so much a mixture of who we think we are and who others tell us we are, that these two concepts, the self and culture, must be discussed together throughout the semester. And that concludes everything for this lecture. I hope you found this instructive. I hope you found this worthwhile. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I'll see you in the next one. Take care, everyone.